Hello and welcome back to Simon's Rants. I'm Simon, and today I just watched Noah Bumbach's Marriage Story. Now, it's on Netflix, and I do believe it's also showing some places, but I just watched it on Netflix. It's starring Scarlett Johansson, Adam Driver, and it's also got Ray Liotta in it, Laura Dern, Alan Alda. It's got a bunch of small little bit parts by a bunch of people, but it's mainly about Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. If you haven't seen the trailers or anything, this is a very realistic look, a very personal look at what divorce looks like between two people. And if you've never seen any of Noah Bumbach's movies before, he's very into this hyper-realistic dialogue and hyper-realistic filmmaking style. And that works some of the time, and it doesn't work some of the time. It works probably most of the time, but it doesn't always work because it's almost like it's trying too hard to be realistic that it stops being realistic again. But there's certain moments where the acting is just great and the writing is just great because it doesn't feel like a movie anymore. It feels like you're watching a conversation. There is multiple scenes in this movie between Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver where it's just them two talking. And it floors you with how powerful it is, with the raw emotion of the scenes, and just the great acting between the two of them. I am a huge Scarlett Johansson fan. I've never been a big Adam Driver fan, but to be fair to him, I'd never seen him in anything special before. I had seen him in the Star Wars movies, and I had seen him in Silence, but I hadn't seen him in anything else, and he was great in this movie, and I think he must be a great actor. He just needs that opportunity to actually do something special, and this was my first opportunity seeing him doing something outside the box, and he was awesome in it. As far as the rest of the cast goes, they were all, for the most part, fine. There was a couple of characters that I hated and didn't really like at all. Scarlett Johansson's mother in particular was a very annoying character, and I think we could have done without her, but I think at the same time, that was kind of the point, is that this movie was imperfect like life is imperfect, and for the most part, that worked. I can get into some stuff later on about what I didn't think was imperfect in a good way, but for the most part, these characters were imperfect as they're supposed to be, imperfect as they would be in real life. Now, while Sean actually has a small role in this movie, and he was phenomenal. He's hilarious. He doesn't say much, but when he's talking, every time you hear him, whether it's in the forefront or you just hear him in the background saying something, this guy's hilarious. He's always been hilarious, but he's got a small part in this, and I loved every second of it. And at a certain point while watching this movie, I thought I loved the movie too. And I was thinking about it, kept defending it to myself, and eventually realized I didn't love the movie, I loved the performances in the movie, and realized that the main reason I liked the movie so much is Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. After them, the rest of the movie's only okay at best. It ranges wildly. There's some great moments, there's some horrible moments in there. For a writer who prides himself on realism, there's some awkward exposition in there. Like, you've got Scarlett Johansson's mom explaining her entire backstory in a conversation to Scarlett Johansson. If anybody knows this stuff already about her, Scarlett Johansson would. And it's like, this obviously was exposition for the audience, and there's awkward dialogue like that in there. So that's frustrating. But then there's other moments, like I had just mentioned, where there's just conversations between Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson where you know they've become estranged at this point. You know there's been a time period where they don't talk to each other the way that they used to. And to see them open up and communicate and have different conversations and start crying, it makes you start crying. This movie is so emotional and so powerful and has some of the most amazingly emotional scenes I've ever seen in any movie. And so it's kind of frustrating to have a stark contrast between stuff like that, moments like that, and then the weaker moments in this film. So if I had to describe this film, I would say it's inconsistent, because I loved moments of this movie. But most of those moments, if not all of those moments, revolved strictly around Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver in this film. Everything else was just okay. I mean, Ray Liotta was fine. Laura Dern was fine. I mean, you hate both characters. They're both like snarky lawyers, and you just hate the way that they manipulate their clients. and you don't like them, but the actors themselves are fine. But I just didn't care for anything beyond the two main characters, and sometimes maybe a character here or there. And there's just different moments throughout this movie that it's like, if this is hyper realistic, why is this happening? There's some great moments where it's the two characters, they're two lawyers sitting down talking, and you're like, this is cool, this is great, this is fairly realistic. And then you've got a scene where they're actually in a courtroom and they're all talking over each other and shouting and standing up and sitting down, and the judge is non-existent for the most part of that scene, and it's one of the most unrealistic courtroom scenes I've ever seen. And I'm like, if this is supposed to be hyper-realistic, why are we getting scenes like this in this movie? And that was just absurd to me. I'm not going to get into spoilers yet. I'll get into spoilers in a little bit, but I'll give a warning first. But without saying anything, I thought the ending was sloppy too. There's so much of this movie that was so good, and it all seemed to have a purpose. And then at the end of the movie, I felt like I kind of wasted my time a little bit. And it's frustrating to say that when you see such great acting performances and you see such great moments in a movie, you want to say the movie as a whole is great. And I can't say that about this movie. And I know a lot of people are. I know it's got great ratings. It's got like an 8.6 on IMDb and like a 94 on Metacritic and all of that stuff. I'm coming out, again, I know, I keep saying this year has been mediocre at best. And this is one of the better movies to come out this year. It really is. But it's still only, to me, like a 7.5. And it's frustrating because it's great at moments, but you can't say that it consistently throughout is great because the inconsistency in the writing's very sloppy at times. Most of the humor in this movie doesn't work, by the way. There's a couple of times it does. Like I mentioned, Sean Wallace is hilarious in this movie, but for the most part, the humor is forced into places it shouldn't be and isn't good. Now, the chemistry and the charisma of the two leads is good enough to fit in humor places that it shouldn't be. Like, Adam Driver is very charismatic in this. Scarlett Johansson is very charismatic. I don't know that she tried to be as funny as Adam Driver did, but regardless, for the most part, for both of them, it went fairly seamlessly. Even when there was just awkward moments that they shouldn't have been being funny, they were able to pull it off okay. But when the plot itself is trying to be funny in places it shouldn't be, it's just a little bit frustrating at times and a little bit cringy at times. Now, I did enjoy watching this movie. I did, because of the chemistry between Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. I loved watching them together. I loved watching them separately. I loved watching both of them the entire time during this movie, and I loved watching how this movie was able to portray a single story from multiple perspectives and really show a genuine attitude toward what a broken marriage looks like. And it was very raw and it was very real for the most part, but at the same time it wasn't consistent throughout, so I have trouble giving it a great rating and saying it's good, pretty good, like a 7.5 good, but I can't give it an 8. I definitely wouldn't go below a 7, though. This is not a 6-star or worse movie. This is at least a 7, but I can't go above a 7.5. 8 just feels too generous with this, which is a shame, because for a while there, I was comparing it to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is my favorite movie of all time. And this movie, in my head, was comparable at times. Some of the raw emotional moments in this movie reminded me of that, which is a great thing to remind me of. And other times it reminded me of Her, which is another one of my favorite movies of all time. And these are great movies to be reminded of. But then unfortunately, there wasn't the same consistency that either of those movies had. Those movies were able to have this raw, painful emotion for the entire runtime. This movie, I felt like feared its audience in a little bit of ways, where it's like it had to sneak in those humor moments to kind of just like help the audience through. And the audience, we don't need the help. Like, don't baby us. This isn't a Marvel movie. You don't need the humor. You can just tell the story. You can just keep punching. Just keep punching away. This writer-director doesn't respect the audience the same way that the other two writers did. And I haven't watched any of his other movies. He's critically acclaimed and all of that. But after watching this, I don't know that I want to watch any more of his movies, because if he's that inconsistent, I feel like I'm just going to get frustrated watching his movies going, you could be great, but you're definitely not. That being said, this movie is definitely worth watching. It's frustrating that the whole thing isn't better, but I definitely don't regret watching it, even if it feels a little incomplete. But man, Adam Driver was great, and man, Scarlett Johansson had herself a great 2019. As bad and as inconsistent and as mediocre as the 2019 film year has been, Scarlett Johansson rocked it, so good for her. So that's what I thought, spoiler free. I'm about to get into spoilers, so if you don't want to see that, you can click away now, but please like, share, and if you're new here, subscribe. Thanks guys, bye. So, spoilers. I guess I'll talk about the ending first, because the ending is frustrating, and it felt like they were just trying to be La La Land in a way, where it's like, hey, it's realistic that people don't always have happy endings. And that's true. But it's really frustrating in the context of this movie that you see these characters growing, you see these characters learning, and you see a way that this could work out, and then it just cuts ahead a year or whatever, and then they're not together anymore. She's remarried, and he's okay with that, kind of. It's just bizarre, where you have like them going through the custody battles, and you have the scene where he cuts himself and then like passes out, and then it just fades to black, and then it hops ahead a year. And at first you don't know it hops ahead of you, you just see him walk in and you see Halloween decorations, and you're like, well, that's weird. Why are the decorations for Halloween still up? Hasn't it been a little bit of time? And then you realize, oh, it's the next year at least. And she's not necessarily remarried, but she's with a new guy. And it just felt manipulative. It felt like it was just going for raw emotion from you without earning it. It just felt like, here you go, shock value, and aren't you upset that this didn't work out? And I'm like, yeah, I am upset it didn't work out. I also feel like you didn't earn this ending. You didn't earn giving me this shock value, because you didn't do anything to earn it. And it's just frustrating that that's the way that it went, when it's like you're watching these characters develop throughout this movie. And I'm not saying that they had to end up together. It doesn't always work out, and I get that. That was the point of the movie, is that sometimes things don't work out, but you see them learning and growing together. You see them improving together. And you see that they're frustrated by all the outside voices. The whole point of this movie to me was them realizing that the outside voices were all lying to them, and they didn't need anybody else. But whenever they were together, that's when true honesty came forward, and they enjoyed that. You had such a real raw emotional scene where they're fighting in his apartment, and they're screaming at each other, and they're crying, and he's on his knees, and it's like, that's probably the best scene of the movie, and it's so powerful. And it's like, that's when you're realizing, you know what, fuck these lawyers. Get these lawyers out of here. They're doing nothing but trouble, and their friends aren't helping because their friends are just encouraging them in their bad behavior. And I don't want any of the outside voices anymore, because they just need each other, because yeah, they're imperfect, but everybody's imperfect. They can work through these things together. And so it's frustrating to not feel like this ending was deserved. This ending wasn't deserved. If you're going to make this point that sometimes things just don't work out, then you need to show that they tried. Otherwise, it just feels like they made this progress and then went, forget it. Why? You even have him moving temporarily to LA at the end of the movie, which was the biggest point of contention between the two of them, honestly, was where to live. And that's frustrating to me, to then say, oh, that doesn't matter. And I get that part of that message in the movie as it was presented was supposed to be like, it's easier after the fact. It's easier to do things in hindsight. It's easier to know things after the fact. And I get that. That's true. There's so many things that you would have easily, there's so many things you would gladly do in a relationship if you had only known previously, and so then after the relationship it's a lot easier to do those things. Like moving to LA was huge and scary, but now that he's lost that relationship and he's lost that tie to his son and his family, now moving to LA, easy. And I get that. But it's like, I don't know, it just frustrated me because it's like, you didn't show them try, even though they were making progress together. I don't get it. And I didn't like that ending. I just didn't. You might say that, oh, you're being overly sentimental and optimistic, and maybe I am, but that's just... And I'm not generally that. I am a cynic. Like, I'm cynical, and I see the worst in everything. But still, this ending just rubbed me the wrong way. So maybe that says something when somebody who's as cynical and cold-hearted as me says that you're being too depressing. And like it felt to me like that typical hipster ending, that typical indie film ending that La La Land did, that a lot of people do, that are trying to just get a shock value reaction. That's what it felt like to me. A lot of people do this just to have that gut punch at the end. It was like, oh, man, this movie was saying something. And it's like, okay, was it though? So that frustrated me a lot. It really did. And there's plenty other things to complain about this movie, but that was my least favorite part about this movie. I think I could have forgiven the entirety of the movie enough to give it an 8 if the ending wasn't like that. And I know if you had them end up being together, that's the cheesy way out. But this was its own form of cheesy way out because this is the cliche thing to do nowadays. It's really popular in the 2010s to have a sad ending where things don't work out, and that's become the cliche thing. So it's not the hyper-realistic, mature way out. It's the cliche thing to do at this point. So that's frustrating to me. And then, like I was saying previously in this video, I didn't like anybody in this movie really, except for Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. And that's fine, but it's just frustrating when it's like, her mom was so annoying, and a lot of these characters were really annoying. And I know that it was on purpose, but just the lawyers were so, especially Nora, I hated her so much. Like, you just wanted to, I didn't like her. But it was really cool to see different things about their personalities unfold throughout this movie. Like, as this movie unwrapped, you saw their weaknesses being told as from their other perspectives, and then eventually from their own as they began to realize their own weaknesses. I loved the fact that how they were in the marriage, they were also in the divorce. And so in the marriage, everything Adam Driver's character did was based out of fear. He was afraid of moving. He was afraid of losing his career. He was afraid of losing everything. He was afraid of losing his 20s. And so he kept making mistakes based on fear. And then during the divorce procedures, everything he then did was based out of fear. Then that was the biggest progression at the end, was then he was able to let go of fear and move out to LA, which was great. And I loved that. I just wish it had amounted to something, but whatever. And I guess you could say that Scarlett Johansson's character was acting out of fear as well, but it manifested differently. I would also say that her character arc was more complex than Adam Driver's, because it wasn't just as simple as I messed up because I was scared and so I hurt the people I cared about most because I was trying to protect myself, which is what Adam Driver did. That's pretty simple, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, I don't mean to take away anything from it by saying it's simple. It's still powerful. But Scarlett Johansson's character just seemed a little bit more deep. They were both complex people with complex problems that I don't think either one of them fully noticed or understood. And that's why that scene where they fought was so good, because they were screaming at each other things that they had wanted to say for years and never had, out of politeness, out of fear, out of all these different things, out of respect. And having finally said those things, God, that was such a good scene. And I love that scene. I guess honestly you could say that for her it was insecurity, which is very similar to fear, but she was acting out of insecurity. And so for Adam Driver, he's screaming at her like, you don't have an identity, you just want to say that you don't have an identity. Your identity is to say that you don't have an identity. His identity is to say he has an identity. He has to be constantly reminding everybody who he is, or he doesn't exist anymore. And she needs somebody to define her, but then she doesn't want to be defined, so she's in constant state of rebellion. And it's like, these are so realistic characters. So realistic. And I loved it. I loved them so much. They were so good. And I just wish that the rest of the movie was as good as they are. That's the frustrating thing. And I know a lot of people are going to ignore that the rest of the movie around them wasn't that good, because that's what people always seem to do. They just say, oh, the centerpiece of this movie is fantastic, and ignore the rest. I'm sorry, I just can't quite do that. So yes, they were amazing. They both should be up for Oscars, Golden Globes, all that jazz. The rest of the movie, however, shouldn't get anything. Just being honest. I do appreciate that they're trying to say, like, even when it doesn't work out, even when you can't be together for whatever reason, maybe you're just not good for each other, maybe you just want different things, you can still love each other. Like, you don't have to hate each other, you can still be friends, you can still love the other person. And I appreciate that they said that, because that's essentially what the message of this movie was. Sometimes things don't work out, but that doesn't mean you have to hate the person for it not working out. You can still love them, but like, you get the vibe, or at least I did, that they're still in love. You see them making steps of growth to work together like they'd never done before. And you just question, why couldn't they have done that together? Now, granted, maybe it wouldn't have worked out, but I just want to see them try. Damn it. I wanted to see them try. I don't know. And that was like one of the coolest things also about this movie, even though the courtroom scene was a giant mess with everybody shouting over each other and being completely awfully written and directed. There was a great part of that, a great element of that, where their lawyers are both accusing the other of owing them money because they are the only reason that they have this, and they're the only reason they have that. And you see in the faces of Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson, they're realizing, we would be nothing without each other. Everything they've accomplished, they accomplished because of each other. And it's not like one person gave everything to the other person and they owe them everything. It's like they both owe each other everything. They both built each other up. They both gave each other so much. They both helped each other. They both are indebted to each other forever. And it's like, that was great. I really do appreciate so much about this movie, because so much about this movie is fair, because nobody in this movie is perfect. They're both completely, entirely flawed people that made mistakes before this movie takes place, during this movie, and will after this movie ends. And I loved that, and I loved seeing that, and I loved seeing the good in both of them as well. And I loved so much about these characters. I just wish, and I keep saying it, I wish the rest of the movie was as good as these two characters were. This movie has some great moments in it, but at the same time, when the movie was over, I had a moment of, that's it? I'm not upset that I watched it, but I'm upset at them. I'm upset at the writer-director. I wish he didn't do that to me. That's just how I feel. It's a very sad movie, but it's very good. Not great, but very good. Great performances by two amazing actors. And, yeah. Glad I watched it. Upset I watched it. I'll get over it. But what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, please subscribe and like. And also, check out the merch. Get it for somebody you know and love who deserves it for Christmas. Maybe yourself. I don't know. Thanks, guys, for supporting me. Thanks, guys, for watching. All that. Thanks. Bye.